Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalam.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We start the
Okay,
session.
perfect. So all participants are here. Shall we start?
Yes.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. My name is Muhammad Shawqi. I am the Assistant Director for Technical Affairs at the Saudi Patient Safety Center. And this session is a continuation for the lovely session that Fadwa has started 1 hour ago about automation and computerization of services, which is the new era that's coming or that's happening nowadays in the whole world. So everybody now is going digital. And I opened the camera, but I'm not sure if it's working. They told me, sorry. You can see me. Because they gave me an instruction. They told me I have to open the camera to promote the interaction between the presenter and the attendees. So now I think now we're good. So going back to the automation and the health information and technology, I think no one would disagree about the importance of automation nowadays and how it improved the services that are provided to patients, and it decreased the risk to a great extent, especially with some features that are being added to the information system, such as the forcing function, which limit the errors or prevent or eliminate the errors in the system, because it forces the professionals to go through certain steps. However, the implementation and the transformation, this transformation from the manual to the electronic system, I've witnessed in a couple of hospitals that throughout my career, those hospitals went from manual system to the electronic system. And in the early weeks of this transformation, we usually find that the rate of the errors increase, not decrease, which is contradicting with the concept. We implement new technology to minimize errors, not to increase errors. This happens usually because the implementation of the new system goes unplanned, without piloting, without risk assessment. So in this 30 minutes, I shall take you through an approach called the failure mode and effect analysis. This failure mode and effect analysis is considered as a risk reduction or risk mitigation strategy that is being implemented when we tend to implement a new technology, a new process, or adjust and modify a current process that exists in the system, just to make sure that this a new introduced or newly modified process was addressed, and all the failures in this process were addressed and were counted for, and we know how to get over these risks and prevent them from happening. The background, just touching a background about the failure mode and effect analysis, it was introduced in the 1940s by the US military when it was used for the launch, prior to the launch of the Apollo space program. And that was because they were using very expensive prototypes. So failures in these prototypes that we're using could have costed the states millions, if not billions of dollars. So they came up with this model called the failure mode and effect analysis, just to know what are the failures or what could go wrong in the system, so they can prevent it from happening. Then it was introduced by Ford in the automotive industry in the 1970s. following a great incident that happened in that time, which was the introduction of the Ford Pinto. Is anyone aware of the Ford Pinto case, and what happened following the introduction of this new model by Ford in the market in the 70s? Okay, I'll tell you the story. That's a very classical case for risk management and risk mitigation. The Ford has introduced a new car model called the Ford Pinto in the 1970s. Then, following the introduction of this car model in the markets, they started receiving complaints from the end users that there was a there was a fault in the model and Pinto, in which when there is a rear end collision, the gas tank ruptures, and then the entire car goes on fire. Lots of incidents were reported, and claims were raised to the Ford company. So Ford company appointed a risk management team to study the case and try to mitigate this risk. And risk management, by definition, is the concept of minimizing the financial loss to the company, so, or any organization. So when the appointed risk management team started on studying the case, they calculated the total cost of calling back recalling all the cars from the market, fixing them and sending back to the market. And they calculated the cost of the claims that would be raised against the company in case of the damage and collision and burn of the cars. Unfortunately, the team found that it's much cheaper to pay for the compensation of the people who were raised claims against the country or the company. This is much cheaper than recalling all the cars from the market, fixing them and sending it back. So the decision of the management was to let the people burn, because it's much cheaper to let the people burn and pay the compensation than fixing the system or fixing the cars. But this carries a significant risk of, or has put the reputation of the Ford company at that time on stake, because they sacrificed the safety and the well-being of their clients because it was much cheaper. So later on, with the introduction of other models, they started heavily using the failure mode and effect analysis before launching a new product, just to make sure that this product is safe and the agony of the Ford Pinto won't happen again. So simply, the failure mode and effect analysis, it is a proactive method that evaluate a process to identify where and how it might fails, and identify all the failures and the causes of these failures and the effect of these failures, so that we start on addressing them and putting forward mitigation strategies to minimize their effects. So it includes a review of the process. So it usually starts by drawing your process and brainstorming and listing down all the steps in this process. Then we start thinking of what could go wrong in each step. So what are the failure modes in each step? What are the causes, or why would the failure happen? And what could be the effect of this failure once it happened on our clients, which is in our case is patient, and on the organization. Why do we use FMEA? Usually there are two risk reduction strategies, which are the failure mode and effect analysis, the FMEA, and another one called the root cause analysis, or the RCA, which is addressed in part of this course. Usually, RCA, or root cause analysis, is reactive. We start doing RCA when we already have a failure that happened in the system, and we want to minimize the effect, or prevent this risk from happening again or recurrence. While FMEA is proactive, so we start on thinking before introduction of a new process or redesigning of a current process of what could go wrong, so to avoid the occurrence of any failures that might put the organization at risk. So it is very useful in evaluating a new process prior to implementation, or assessing the impact of a proposed change to an existing process. And a common pitfall or a common mistake that call it patient safety professionals fall into is implementing FMEA following an error, or a risk that already happened in the organization. So this is one thing to bear in mind, at all times that FMEA is proactive, and we use it whenever we are starting a new process or changing a current process that we're having. The process is very simple. It has around 4 or 5 steps, mainly using brainstorming techniques. Step number one, start by selecting a process to evaluate with the failure mode and effect analysis. Usually, when we select process, try to make sure that this process is simple as much as possible. It's not a complicated process that has too many sub processes, because this carry a significant risk that you might miss something, or a step, or a risk or failure in the process, and the entire process, or the entire exercise of the FMEA would be very lengthy. A classic example for this is the medication management process. Medication management is a very big process that has so many sub-processes. It involves prescribing, transcribing, dispensing, and administration. And each of those is considered a process by itself. So if you tend to do an FMEA, an electronic prescribing system, that's one of the aspects of a medication management system, which is prescribing. But never do an FMEA in the full medication management process. Try to break it down first into the simplest form. Step number two is recruiting a multidisciplinary team. And a multidisciplinary team, it means that we need to involve each and every person who is touched by the process, or a subject matter expert in this process. Because again, remember, it's a brainstorming technique. So we want the right people to be on the table, to avoid missing any part or any step, even if it's a minor step in the process that could cause a failure later on. So usually, for example, in our example, when we're going for the electronic prescribing doesn't mean that we will only involve physicians because they do prescribe. We have to involve physicians, we have to involve nurses, we have to involve technicians, we have to involve pharmacists, so that all the brains come together on one table and they start describing the process and brainstorming what are the failures that could happen. Second step, after recruiting the multidisciplinary team who are touched by the process, is having this team to meet together to list all of the steps of the process. So every step should be numbered, and a very useful tool to be in this used in this step is the flow chart. Either there are so many types of flow chart. There is the simple flow chart, there is the detailed flowcharts, there are the value-based flowchart that gives you an classification or categorization of each step according to whether if it's a value added or non-value added step to your process. So it's the flowchart is one of the useful tools to be used during this exercise. And then after drawing the process, we list down each and every step in this process. Then step number 4 would be listing down the failures that could happen in each step of this process. We might identify one failure for each process or multiple failures, and this is there is no right or wrongs at this stage. The team need to be thorough and detailed as much as possible to identify all the failures that in this process to start working on these failures. Once we have identified the failures and or the failure modes, we start identifying what are the causes of these failures and what are the effects. After identifying the cause and effect, we step number 5 is assigning a prioritization, because at this stage we will have too many failures or failure modes in the process. It's not wise to work on them all. Usually an exercise for prioritization to know what are the failure modes that are most significant and carry the significant risk to the process. And we use this by or we identify this by using the RPN, or the risk priority number. So we identify the likelihood of occurrence and we give it a score of 1 to 10, which is how likely is this failure mode will occur. So we assign a score for the likelihood of the occurrence. Then we assign a score for the severity, which is if this occurrence happened, what how severe is it to the organization or a patient, and we give it a score of 1 to 10. Then the detection, and for the detection, you need to pay attention for this. Detection has a reversed score. So for likelihood of occurrence and severity of failure, we give it a score of 1 to 10. While for the detection, we give it a score of 1 to 10, but on an inverted scale. So if the incident that we're having or talking about is extremely severe, we give it a score of 10. If the likelihood of occurrence, this can easily occur or occurs frequently, we give it a score of 10. But if we can easily detect it, we give it a score of 1. If the detectability of this occurrence is very hard, we give it a score of 10. So just pay attention when you are assigning your RPN that the likelihood or the detection is on an inverted scale. Then we multiply the severity by occurrence by detection, which gives us a score. Then we use this score to prioritize the failure modes that we are having. So we use these failure modes with the highest score to work on and to plan our improvement. There is an online interactive tool that you can find in this link in the IHI, which easily you can use it directly. You just put down your failure modes and identify the causes and the severity. Then you start by putting a score for the occurrence, severity, and detection. And simply the tool will calculate the RPN and prioritize the failure mode. This is an online tool that you can find it for free on the website of the IHI. And here is a working example that I'll take you through it. This example is for prescribing. Here in Saudi Arabia, we have implemented an electronic prescribing system called Wasfati. This is a national system. So it is a standard system across Saudi Arabia, powered by the Ministry of Health. when or prior to the implementation of this WASFATI electronic prescribing system, a multidisciplinary team went through the process and they identified each and every step in this process. So they identified the steps to be the patient identification, then medication entry into the system, then an alert mechanism that is included in the system. Then the alert mechanism, if identified something wrong, it sends an SMS to the providers. So we started by identifying the failure modes or what could go wrong in each and every step in these processes. So for example, the patient identification, what could go wrong? A wrong patient, for example, a wrong MRN could be entered into the system. What would be the cause of this failure? Either language barrier, because here in Saudi Arabia, we do have providers from all over the world who speaks lots of different language and different accents. Even if they do speak Arabic or English, which are the most common languages in Saudi Arabia, still the accent itself is a barrier. Or the cause might be not using the two patient identifier because of a shortcut that was conducted by the healthcare provider, or even workload. And we know, especially nurses, they are very much overloaded, or the physicians in the ICU, especially these days with the COVID-19. The workload can and force so many errors to happen. So these are the potential causes for this failure. What is the effect or the consequence of this failure mode if it happened? A wrong patient information, a wrong MRN leading to a patient harm. So what is the likelihood of having a wrong file number on a scale of 1 to 10, where the likelihood at 10 is very high and at 1 it's very low? So we suggested a score of 3 for the likelihood of this. It happens, but not very frequent. Then, is it detectable? How can we detect it? It's very easily detected because there is a forcing function in the system. So we gave it a score of 2 because it's not very risky since it is highly detectable. But what is the severity if this error was carried through the system and it touched the patient? The severity is 8 because it carries a significant risk of patient harm. How do we calculate the RPN? We multiply 3 by 2 by 8, so it gives us a score of 48. Then, as you can see, after doing this exercise for all the failure modes identified, if you can find that failure modes number 16, 17, and 21 are the most significant with the highest RPN score. So we put actions to reduce or mitigate the risks of those failure modes as a priority because they carries the most significant risk to our process. There is another example in the slides. I'm sure, and I asked Rakan to send you FMEA of the entire medication management system that we've done here in Saudi Arabia prior to the implementation of the WASFATI system, so that it can be used by you as a reference whenever you do an FMEA. There is another example that is, this is the example that was proposed by the materials that is used by the by the NPSF. You can go through it, although it's much more technical. If you're not a pharmacist, you will have difficulty understanding it. But the other example is a very easy, familiar, and straightforward example that you can go through. That was the end of my slides for today, inshallah. And I think we still have time if you do have any questions that you want to ask me. Otherwise, I'll be with you again, inshallah. I'll have the pleasure to start with you tomorrow at 8 a.m. in the morning with a very, very interesting topic, at least for me, which is the data management in healthcare and how can we make use of these data. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Shoki. Thank you very much. So, we'll see you tomorrow morning, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you, Dr.
Inshallah. Thank you,
Hussein.
Dr. Hussein.